Hi, my name is Corey. I have a property management company in Long Island. I manage mostly properties in Brooklyn, and I deal with a lot of 6, 8, 10 family walk-up, mostly subsidized buildings. So I had an interesting issue. I had a tenant, we'll call her Susan, who lived in an apartment. She passed away. Her son Michael took over the apartment, and then Michael passed away. So I went to clean out the apartment and do what I do with all the contents, and whether it's putting it to storage or donating. And his mother's ashes were in the apartment. So we called his kin, whoever we could find, and nobody wanted to take possession. So we just didn't know what to do with it. I ended up calling the city morgue. I called a funeral home. And at the end of the day, their suggestion was just to scatter the ashes in a nice place, and that's what I ended up doing. So I'm interested to see what other people think about this.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah.
Welcome to the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hey everybody, this is Eric Worrell, and this is episode 171 of the RentPrep for Landlords podcast, and we are talking about what to do with abandoned property in your rentals. So recently I was online and I was reading a forum, and this guy was talking about how he had a former tenant's ashes left inside of his rental property. He had no idea what to do with it, and he was just kind of throwing it out there to see if anybody else has dealt with this. And Corey was nice enough to leave us a voicemail to lead into the intro of this podcast. And what we're going to be doing here is we're actually going to be rebroadcasting an episode. It's actually episode number 11, so going a ways back. So you're going to hear Steve and Jeff Pearsons. Jeff used to co-host the podcast with Steve, talking about what to do with abandoned rental property. And just for context, I might be dropping out of a couple episodes here because I'm expecting the birth of my first child. So I'm going to be busy figuring out how to be a real adult. And once I get my feet underneath me again, I will be back on the podcast more regularly with Steve with new episodes. So we're going to send it over to Steve and Jeff. And again, they're going to be talking about what to do with abandoned property. And again, thank you to Corey for that interesting intro. Very interesting. I never heard of anything like that, and we get a lot of different comments and calls and emails and everything from landlords talking about the different issues they're dealing with, and that's the first one we've heard of somebody having to deal with the ashes left over from a tenant. So very interesting. All right, take it away, Steve and Jeff.
Welcome back to another episode of Landlord University Night School. This is Jeff.
And this is Stephen.
So, Stephen, we have an interesting topic. So your tenant abandons the rental. Now what?
We hear a lot of this. A lot of tenants don't want to go through the eviction process. A lot of tenants know that they're behind on rent or know that they've, damaged the property and don't want to have that confrontation with the landlord at the end of it. And so they just pick up their stuff and leave in the middle of the night and call it a day. And that's that. So landlords have to deal with abandonment quite often.
So it seems really simple, but there are three major issues or major mistakes that landlords can make, and I think we want to talk about those three items. So mistake number one, assuming it's abandoned when it's not. I mean, we all know a landlord can't just walk into a place at will. They have to give proper notice and take all of those steps. So when you think it's abandoned and you decide you're just going to walk in, that might not be a good thing. So what are some of the things that landlords need to think about?
I think that there's a number of questions that the landlord can ask themselves. So I'll go down the line here. So number one, are they behind on paying rent? Do they have the utilities shut off? Is there anything left in the rental unit? Is it completely empty or is there still furniture in there? I know that that's not always an exact indicator because people will certainly leave stuff behind, but definitely something to consider. You want to be able to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Did the neighbors notice anything significant? So, if you go and talk to the neighbors, they might be able to tell you, yeah, we saw a moving truck come by and, a U-Haul, and on a Saturday afternoon, they had everything packed up and they were gone. Change of address been submitted to the post office. That's a pretty easy way to figure it out too. Just go right to the post office and ask, and have them be able to reverse look the person's name. And contact the tenant's emergency contacts. If you did a good enough job in the beginning of getting them to fill out the application and not leaving any blank spaces, you should be able to get in touch with their references and nearest relatives and say, hey, do you know what's going on with Susie or Johnny, and do you know where they are? So usually, you're able to put the pieces of the puzzle together well enough to be able to effectively say, yeah, they're gone, they're not coming back. Or maybe they're on a really long vacation. I don't know.
Right. And, there's always the obvious. You pull up to a place and it looks like it's vacant. They've abandoned it. The first thing, make sure you contact all of the phone numbers that you have on your application. Give them a call on the cell phone, because you'd be surprised. Our first thought is, oh, it's abandoned, and we might head down this path of all of these other things. Or, like I said before, just walking in the door, which you can't do. Give them a call, and if they listed 2 or 3 numbers for a couple of different occupants, be sure to try to call all of them. And I would suggest be friendly. Hey, this is your friendly landlord. It looks like the place is abandoned. I was going to go check it out. Yeah, let me know. Give me a call. Send me a text. And a text is a good thing. They can send a text without having to talk to you if they don't want to talk to you. But kind of start with that obvious and then move on to these other steps. But certainly don't put the key in the door and walk in until you've done everything you can to confirm it.
Right. Well, I think that's also, that leads to mistake number 2, which is starting to actually dispose of their personal property and treating it as an abandoned property if it may not be. So that's another huge mistake that landlords make and get themselves into some trouble. You can't just get their stuff out of there and assume this is it, they're gone. And some states have specific rules that deal with tenants' personal property. And so I think, Jeff, perfect for you. You're in California. So California has some of the strictest landlord-tenant laws. And California has specific landlord-tenant laws regarding this exact issue. And what they say is you basically can give the tenant 18 days to claim the property after you've gotten the property out of there, you've taken possession of it. You got to give them notice. You have to be able to store it, charge them for storage. It needs to be reasonable, obviously. If the property's not claimed within 18 days, it's yours, so long as it's less than $300. If it's worth more than $300, the property has to be sold at a public auction. So if you're storing it in a storage, self-storage facility, they can hold the public auction. And you can also contact different vendors that also do auctions and things like that pretty regularly.
And this applies whether they just walked away and abandoned, whether they moved out, or whether they were evicted, right? Yes.
And also, if they died in the place. We've had that question before. If the tenant dies in the apartment, what do you do? If they don't have any family, if they don't have a nearest relative, next of kin, and you're left kind of with all this stuff, what the heck do you do with it? So same thing applies. It's not your property until the state says it's your property. So you need to follow all the right steps in how you're treating their property until legally it's yours.
So make sure you check the laws for your state, county, and city to be sure that you're doing everything the way it needs to be done. But don't just assume you can keep it or dispose of it at will, because there are laws that tell you how to handle it for your area.
Yeah, definitely. Check your local landlord-tenant laws for sure. Like I said, California is notorious. Kansas is another state that has specific laws, and North Carolina as well. So, some states are extremely specific. Some states, leave a little bit more for interpretation, or, give a little bit more leniency and favor the tenant. Some absolutely favor the landlords too. So it's a good idea to check and make sure you know what you're dealing with.
So the third big mistake, failing to document the process. I mean, everything that we do as landlords needs to be documented. They fill out an application, that's documentation. You have an agreement, a rental agreement, that's documentation. But when somebody abandons a property, you need to write it down. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the best example I can give you actually doesn't really have a lot to do with the the abandonment, maybe so, but more so my experience in collecting past due rent. So we used to handle a lot of judgments for past due rent, and I can tell you that the ones that we had approved by a judge, or the ones that were executed, were the ones that had the best documentation, pictures taken. We didn't charge a ridiculous amount in damages and things like that. We just did, like you said, did a great job documenting, not only in writing, but also taking photographic pictures, proof of everything. And the same goes for abandonment. You want to make sure that you're going in there, you're taking pictures of everything that you can. If there's damages, even if there's not damages, just to be able to show this place is empty. So those pictures definitely come, really, really, they come into play, and they're really valuable for proving, the point that you want to make.
Right. Pictures, or in this day, video. I mean, you can pull out your smartphone and just walk through and take pictures, video what you're seeing and make comments as you're doing it.
Yep.
And
same thing with, if you can gather additional documents, let's say, from the utility companies, proof that they had, shut off dates, proof that they had called to get the gas or the water shut off, anything specific like that. Again, just more documentation that you can store in your back pocket. And eventually, if you are going to seek judgment against them for past due rent or anything, these are all things that you can use to, help build your case.
So we've got these three major mistakes and the basic process of what people need to do. Is there anything else you can think about when you believe that a property has been abandoned?
Documentation is the most important thing. I mean, hands down, you want to be sure that you're still filing all the proper notices. You're still treating it as if you don't really know. Even if you do know, even if you're fairly confident, you're able to look in there and see it's empty. You don't want to do anything where you're going to get yourself in trouble, and the tenant's going to file against you because you went in there and wrongfully locked them out. Let's say you can't just go in there and change the lock if you haven't given them proper notice that they're not supposed to be there anymore. So you still have to take all the right steps.
And if their rent is past due, you probably need to continue to follow the eviction process.
Yeah, and again, when that rent is when you finally do have a tally of it, you're going to want to be able to present that in court to be able to get a judgment on the tenant. So all that stuff is going to come into play. The eviction process, what they owe, well documented damages. All these things are going to help in the long run to be able to say this person owes me X amount of money for past due rent and these damages.
Right. And then again, if they really haven't moved out, and that was one of those 1 in 1,000 situations where it seems to be abandoned, but they really are planning to come back. If you haven't started the eviction process, you're just pushing back the inevitable that you might have to do it sometime in the future. So, send your pay or quit and do everything according to your attorney's advice or the process that you use for evictions.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, Stephen, this wraps up another evening of night school. Have a good evening.